In the last video, we met Sherlock, the charming new owner of a rundown dungeon, and Saber, his unusual talking magical dungeon core. Together, they hatched a plan to summon players from another world, our Earth, and have them work in his dungeon. A link to that video is in the description below. And now, on with the show. Sherlock ponders the mysterious green orb pulled from the spider. While he's not sure what it is, he thinks it must be valuable. Looking over at the two goblins which helped Simba, which I'm just now realizing were Kuruko and Arthur, Sherlock tells them to prepare for a trip to Winterfell with him. The other goblins look on with envy, seeing that these two goblins were not only in the first party to fight a spider, but are now getting to go on a special trip to a city. One wonders aloud if this is the power of whaling, but another points out that there's no system for paying for things in this game yet. I feel like I should explain for any non-gamers out there in our audience. Whales is a gaming term used to describe a player which spends a very large amount of real-world currency on items or advancements in a video game. Pulling out another of his magical teleport scrolls, Sherlock bids Arthur and Kuruko to stand closer as he activates it. Magical forces gather around the group, and in a flash, they're teleported from the dungeon. The gathered goblins shout with interest in their lord's powers, and wonder if there's some way they'll be able to get their hands on a teleport scroll themselves someday. Arriving in Winterfell, the two goblins are delighted. They seem to be taking screenshots like crazy, excited to share them on the forum later. An orc tells them to hurry up and fill out their paperwork, and Sherlock leads them into the city. We see the market streets again, and Kuruko remarks that this will make an excellent scoop for his video blog. Sherlock stops suddenly and announces that they've arrived. The distracted goblins run into his back. Entering the merchant shop, the goblins run around like children, looking over all the items with excitement. Sherlock approaches the well-dressed goblin who seems to be running the place. The goblin merchant launches into a pitch about an amazing type of magic wand, which he has for sale, inviting Sherlock to haggle for a good deal on it. Before Sherlock can respond, Arthur shouts at the merchant, stating that he wants to spend some money and let off some steam. Kuruko is surprised to learn his gaming pal appears to be loaded and willing to spend. The merchant seems to be annoyed by these mere servants speaking so rudely to him, and politely tells Sherlock his assistants seem to lack common sense. Sherlock apologizes for them and states that he's actually here to have a magic item appraised. He pulls out the large green orb which was found in the spider. Arthur's bothered that the NPCs of this game won't even tell him where to spend money in it, but Kuruko tells his rich friend to calm down and let the mission cutscene play out. The merchant pulls out a book and, carefully consulting it, then gives the orb an appraising lick. Sherlock wonders if he should have mentioned that this came out of the guts of a spider, but then figures it's too late now. The goblin confidently states that this orb is the key to an ancient ruin. Picking up the orb, Kuruko shouts in amazement that he never thought he'd be lucky enough to be involved in both of the first big quests of the game. Then the merchant goblin says that even though it's a key to an ancient site, the most he can offer Sherlock for it would be 5,000 stones. Sherlock scoffs at this offer, saying the usual price should be 50,000, and tells his subordinates that they'll be leaving. The merchant heads Sherlock off before he can go, and tries another approach. He says he knows Sherlock will simply try and find the site himself, but that this is a difficult proposition. He suggests a joint venture, wherein Sherlock will sell the shop the orb, but he'll reserve the rights to explore the ruins with them once they're located. The merchant suggests a price of 6,000 stones and a friendly gift from their shop. Sherlock says this sounds like a reasonable arrangement, but that it would all depend on the value of the gift the merchant intends to include. The merchant agrees and goes to fetch the item in question. A cage holding a female figure with wings is brought into view, and the goblin claims that this is a fairy from the Tree of Life, proficient in alchemy and herbal medicine, and that she can create high-level potions from simple materials. The merchant laments that the fairy is extremely stubborn and that he hasn't even heard her speak since arriving. He says she recently stopped eating, apparently intending to starve herself to death. Sherlock finds this to be an acceptable trade, as her skills sound quite useful. The merchant transfers the money to Sherlock, and they thank one another for a successful business deal. With the money in hand, Sherlock reflects that this means he finally has Simba's salary secured. He never expected that they would find a valuable artifact like this. Exiting the shop, Sherlock tells his two goblin assistants to wait for him, as he's going to go purchase herbs. This disappoints them, as they'd wanted to see more of the city. Sherlock enters a very interesting-looking greenhouse. This is the secret garden florist shop, while looking over a plant with teeth, which looks suspiciously like the piranha plant enemy from Super Mario. Sherlock thinks to himself that the shop has a warm and peaceful environment. A Taurine welcomes him to the shop, stating that they have many new shipments on hand and invites him to appreciate them with a cup of tea. Sherlock cuts to his business and states that he wants to build a parter and purchase some herbs. Dear listeners, I had to go look that word up. Parter is a French term for an ornamental garden with small beds and paths between them. Never stop learning, folks. The Taurine comments that to grow quality flowers, he'll need quality soil. He suggests nether soil or eternal soil, as both should help immensely. Sherlock says that this is no problem, but then mentions that he'll need seeds suitable for a fairy, since one will be the caretaker for the plants. The Taurine agrees that caution will be needed for a fairy gardener, as some plants could eat a fairy. He then quotes Sherlock a price of 100,000 magic stones for the parter and the herbs to plant it with. Sherlock says the price isn't an issue, that he has plenty to spend. I'm a bit confused about this, as this is still way more than he just earned from selling the magic orb, but perhaps the translators were a bit off on the numbers here. With a delighted smile, the Taurine thanks Sherlock for his patronage and offers to gift Sherlock some stone golems to help build the new parterre. Returning to his waiting goblins, Arthur asks what the new fairy is about, and if he can finally spend some money. Kuriko just seems happy he got a huge scoop for his blog. Upon the group's return, the goblins wonder what these new goods are and if their living conditions will be improved. Another chides back that there's no comfort to be found in the dungeon. Others remark on the interesting new golem workers brought back. Kuriko suddenly lets out a shout, warning his lord that the fairy they brought back has just fainted. Chapter 7. The goblins stand around the fainted fairy with interest, with some wondering if this will be the new playable race for them, others disagreeing, since this is a creature from the surface. Another says he heard that this fairy would teach them new skills. The goblins continue to discuss that herb gardening will clearly be the next skill they can learn from her, since Sherlock has already ordered construction of wells and greenhouse buildings. Plus, Sherlock ordered them to take care of the fairy. There must be a reason. The fairy wakes up weakly, wondering who surrounds her. The goblins don't notice, however, continuing to discuss that they don't know anything about how to take care of a fairy. Luckily, Sherlock has informed them that the fairy eats flowers, so the goblins have already dispatched workers on flower collecting missions. The goblins hope the fairy survives, as they don't want to fail this new game mission. The fairy, more awake now, sits up and asks if she's in heaven, but then sadly realizes that it's quite the opposite. She's in a monster nest. The goblins, seeing she's awake, excitedly call to have flowers brought for her and for someone to inform their great lord. They gather around the trapped fairy, offering her water, flowers, asking for missions, and for her to teach them alchemy. The goblins are disappointed that their words are having no effect, thinking that they might need to wait for some kind of game condition to be met before she'll respond. Seeing Sherlock approaching, they call for everyone to get out of the way and let the cutscene play out. Looking the part of a true demon lord, Sherlock's powerful dark aura causes the poor frightened fairy to cry out in fear, begging him to stay back. He greets her politely, however, introducing himself as the city's lord and her new master. He then asks her a question. Would she like to go home? He acknowledges her obvious distrust of him, but then lays out his offer. If she can use her skills to earn him 50,000 magic stones, he'll release her. The fairy defiantly yells back that she'll never make a deal with a demon, fearing that this can only lead to the loss of her soul. She declares she'll never help him, even if it means she has to starve herself to death. Sherlock simply says for her to let him know once she's changed her mind, and turns to walk away. The goblins are confused. It would seem that since Sherlock didn't convince the fairy to join their side, they won't be able to learn new skills from her yet. However, another goblin shouts that clearly the job is up to them as the players to convince her. Elsewhere in the dungeon, Saber asks Sherlock why he didn't simply torture the fairy. Sherlock seems a bit offended at the suggestion and explains that while the demons of 100 years ago might have used torture, the style of a modern demon is to manipulate hearts and minds. Saber says he understands and will pass on orders to make sure the fairy is cared for. Looking over the construction of his new herb garden, Sherlock is pleased with the progress the golems are making. He then comments that he'll need to have Simba make more tools, so that the goblins can then build further improvements to it. Saber points out that proper tools will require wood, and that if they chop down trees on the surface, they might attract dangerous attention from the nearby human kingdom. Since their dungeon lacks a military, if an adventuring party were to show up, they'd be in big trouble. Sherlock agrees and asks Saber to look into finding an underground forest. Furthermore, he continues, they don't really need wood for the tool handles. The players will become more tired without them, but it would save them money. Saber says exactly what I'm thinking, which is that this is a very on-brand thought for Sherlock. Sherlock tells Saber to head home, and that he's going to check what the people in the sky, as he calls them, are saying about his dungeon on the forum. Settling in at his magical computer, a post quickly grabs his attention. It states that Eternal Kingdom is very likely opening a new town soon, Winterfell. Opening the video, we're greeted by the face of our favourite goblin internet star, Beta Testa Meshwan Kuko. Just to be clear, that's his actual name. His in-game name is Kuruko Yumekaiwa. I'm just going to call him Kuruko going forward. Kuruko recounts recent events, telling his viewers that he and several players attempted to brave the new spider cave earlier today, but didn't even last 10 minutes before being defeated. However, their deaths were not in vain, as Arthur managed to kill one of the spiders and the orb it dropped brought them to 2 special quests. Due to this new quest, Kuruko and Arthur were allowed to visit the new game area, Winterfell. Kuruko is pleased to report that the detail level of the city is amazing, with incredible NPCs everywhere. It seems like each one is modeled to have free will and go about the town. He just can't imagine what the programming for this is like. He's fairly sure the city is just like their dungeon, with everything interactive and full of interesting details. He regrets that he didn't get to look around too much, but shows off the many screenshots he took. Sherlock comments that Kuruko is quite meticulous watching the video. Saber says that players are simply like this. They love to share their gaming tactics. As the video continues, Kuruko says that he's learning that the game mechanics are very complicated. He feels this game will become like a second life for those who play it. He says that he's already hyped it up enough. At this point, people just have to take a look for themselves. Changing topics, Kuruko has updates about stats. He explains that he now understands why there are no stat numbers or digital hit points. He now thinks this is because the game is tracking statistics for each player based on what they've done in the world. He thinks this because after doing dungeon work for 2 days now, he actually feels more powerful. Typical gamer, no idea how muscles work. You can apply this trick in our real world also, friends. Kuruko continues, reporting on the new fairy NPC, who should be in charge of herbs and alchemy. However, she's unwilling to work with them, with players speculating that this has to do with the hostile relationship between their factions. Kuruko encourages players to come investigate this situation, as it will likely trigger another hidden quest, he thinks. Moving on to equipment, Kuruko explains that he can equip armor and weapons now. Unlike characters, these items do have statistics, such as power levels and elemental effects. He comments that the equipment is quite expensive, and that the rich kids will have to wait for an in-game shop so they can afford it. Kuruko finishes his updates by discussing the new reputation system. Completing quests allows goblins to gain reputation, and this in turn allows them to equip items. He thinks it's a bit bare bones for now, but that it should have more users as the game develops. Kuruko signs off saying that everyone in the dungeon is working hard to earn equipment, and that he expects a group will be able to take out the spider dungeon soon. Cutting to the present, it appears that the goblins wasted no time at all, as Sherlock and Saber are surprised to see that another raiding party has already formed and is about to set off. Shouting that they fight for the glory of their city lord, the goblin adventuring party heads into the portal with great excitement, their crude iron weapons at the ready. Chapter 8. Sherlock watches his players from his magical monitor, a bit concerned by their flamboyant style. It would seem the battle isn't going well, and Sherlock asks Saber if this is really entertaining for these players. There's no joy to be found by being defeated over and over, right? Saber agrees, but then reminds him that to them this is just a challenging game. Sherlock wonders if the world of the players has no war, since they seem to have no idea how to fight. Saber tells him that they do have war, but it's different there, with little need for hand-to-hand combat, and with many not even experiencing any fighting in their lives. Growing concerned, Saber mentions that if they're defeated over and over, players might rage quit. Sherlock is unfamiliar with this term, so Saber explains that it's an otherworldly term for those who no longer find fun in a game and stop playing it. Sherlock doesn't like the idea of losing his free labour force, and Saber agrees that they'll need to take measures to ensure the goblins stay happy and working hard. Sherlock asks what Saber suggests, and he explains that they'll need to give the players systems to grow stronger with, so that even when they die, they feel they're making some progress. Sherlock agrees that this is a good idea. Even beyond helping keep the players happy, this system should also work well with the limited resources he has to work with. Telling Saber to console the players once they return, Sherlock announces that he's going to Winterfell to find a skill trainer. Saber seems a bit confused as to what Sherlock meant, but figures he'll give them some kind of reward. We then see an announcement sent to the players, informing them that the warriors who attack the spider lair will receive 10 copper coins, and announcing that more skill trainers will be available soon. Saber, you cheap jerk. That's only 1/60th of the amount needed to buy replacement equipment, isn't it? In Winterfell, Sherlock approaches the succubus who first sold him the dungeon and confidently asks her for a battle skill trainer. She greets him warmly and asks how much he'd be willing to pay. When Sherlock replies that his budget is 20 magic stones, she's clearly a bit less enthused and tells him that his request can't be filled for that amount. Sherlock explains that he's not looking for a proper warrior. Anyone who can train simple goblins would do, and that his low budget is simply because his dungeon is small and starting out. The succubus tells him that they simply don't publish job notices for anything under 200 magic stones. Attempting to apply his riz, Sherlock leans in and asks her if she can't do something based on their previous relationship. The succubus demurely points out that they've only actually met twice. Undeterred, Sherlock points out that at one of those meetings she sold him a dungeon with a half-rotten core, and that due to that, he feels she owes him a little help with this reasonable request. Taking a quick glance around to make sure nobody is listening in, the succubus whispers to Sherlock that she'll keep an eye out for him. If she comes across anyone who seems suitable, she'll send them to him. This pleases Sherlock, who thanks her and reminds her that he'd like the trainer as soon as possible. As they walk to leave the town, Saber says that seeing the sales succubus just now made him think of something. He says that he thinks Sherlock needs an assistant, as it could save a lot of time. Sherlock replies that this would mean he's spending more on salaries, and that it wouldn't be cost effective. Saber persists, saying that perhaps they could hire someone part-time, and suggests the sales succubus as a candidate. Sherlock agrees, telling Saber to feel free to ask her, as he activates a magic scroll to return to the dungeon. As soon as Sherlock appears in the dungeon, various goblins crowd around him, asking him about the new skill training update that was announced. Sherlock realizes Saber must have announced something, and Saber says that the goblins seem to have misunderstood, and they now seem to think Sherlock will be training them. Sherlock unveils his wings and proudly announces that he's hired a goblin trainer to increase the players' combat skills, and that he has hope they can be turned into good soldiers. This news pumps the crowd up, and shouts of "Hail Sherlock" ring out, along with questions as to if they can spend money on this new feature. Later, at the dungeon core, Sherlock is preparing an official announcement for the players when suddenly Saber turns red. A sealed letter pops out of him, and Sherlock realizes he's gotten a message. The letter is from the sales succubus, informing Sherlock that she's found a suitable candidate and requesting a finder's fee of 5 magic stones. The note is signed, and we learn that the succub's name is Evelyn. Saber comments again that the succubus seems like a skilled worker and that he thinks she'd make a fine assistant. Saber then announces that he's receiving a teleportation scroll request. He thinks it's probably the trainer Evelyn has sent them and asks if he should allow the connection. Sherlock tells him to do it, and the teleportation gate opens, much to the surprise of the working goblins. They wonder if this must be the new trainer NPC and head over to look. Stepping from the gate, a rather beat-up looking goblin emerges from the portal. Seeing so many goblins, the newcomer concludes that this demon lord must be rich and thinks that perhaps he's found a good place to work. Karuko voices up from the group and points out that this new goblin is the gate guard he saw at Winterfell. This excites the goblins, who now think this new NPC must be related to unlocking access to the Winterfell town. Sherlock steps forward and the new goblin bows deeply to him, introducing himself as the elite guard unit Captain Morris and offering to train Sherlock's brave forces. He stops short upon taking in the rather ragtag-looking group, however, clearly having expected them to be a bit better equipped and more impressive looking. The players are just as confused and wonder if he must be the new trainer the notice promised them. They then become excited at the idea of learning new skills. Sherlock recognizes Morris as being a guard from the city's teleportation gate lobby. Morris proudly shows his city badge and says that he can be trusted to do the job. He goes on to explain that when he was young, he was considered a skilled warrior, but then he got married. It seems his marriage brought him some frustrations after that point. Sherlock, clearly not really interested in this guy's life story, stops him and says he simply needs someone who can train his goblins to be able to fight dungeon spiders. If he can do that, he's hired. Morris bows deeply again, accepting the job assignment. Sherlock draws up some kind of magical contract for Morris, and he quickly agrees. Morris then asks what he should do next, and Sherlock asks him to follow. Elsewhere, Sherlock explains that his dungeon is quite unique. He doesn't want the goblins to train for too long. They will get 2 hours of free training per day and will then need to pay for any additional time. Payments will not be done with magic stones, but with gold currency. Morris will get a half-hour of rest between training sessions. Sherlock asks if these conditions are acceptable, and Morris agrees. He has some questions, however. He's curious why the demon deals with the worthless gold currency. He also has to point out that goblins are simply not very fit to be warriors. In his experience, goblins usually don't want to fight hard, preferring to evade and dodge. Furthermore, if training requires payment, won't this just discourage the goblins from wanting to train in the first place? Sherlock simply tells him that this is the system of his dungeon, and that once he starts training the goblins, he'll understand. Sherlock hands Morris a new badge to show his position, and reminds him that the first day of training will be offered for free. Morris replies that he understands, and will get to work. Later, the training grounds is ready, and a large number of goblins have assembled, quite excited at the idea of finally getting to train some new skills. Morris is a bit taken back. He'd assumed he would need to make an example of someone to get them to fall in line, but the goblins appear ready to train. Morris introduces himself to the goblins and explains the new rules about the 2 hours of free training a day. The goblins enthusiastically declare that they get it, and we get a training montage. Imagine some 80s music in your mind, dear listeners. These goblins are getting strong. Meanwhile, Sherlock looks down on his new herb garden and wonders at the sight of a goblin named Ranty, who seems to be sitting out of the combat training. He asks Saber why this player isn't off with the others, since Saber had assured him that the goblins would all love the new training. Saber remarks that perhaps she's a pacifist player who plays games for the sightseeing rather than the combat. Looking over the dilapidated state of his domain, Sherlock wonders what sights there are to see here, but then concludes that this isn't a problem. Players like this can learn herbal medicine from the fairy. Thinking of the larger picture, Sherlock is pleased. It seems his dungeon is finally on the right track to develop quickly. His goals are coming closer to achievement. Back at the training grounds, Morris addresses his new students and says that he wishes to test their strength. He asks who the first among them to challenge him will be. It seems no one is feeling too confident until a voice rings out that they'll do it. It's our boy Arthur, the one who killed the spider. He declares that he wants to try his strength. Morris simply tells him to come at him then. The fight begins, and is over quickly. It seems Morris easily defeated him. The assembled goblins are shocked at Morris' power, thinking that he must be an example of what a second-tier goblin looks like, and it seems many would like to be this powerful themselves. More goblins try to attack Morris, but despite this guy looking like he just got out of the hospital, he's apparently much stronger than the player goblins. He easily defeats all his challengers, dropping his weapon in disgust. He says that the goblins can't even slash their swords properly, and that they must be the worst trainees he's ever seen. Humbled, the goblins explain to their new teacher that this is the first time they've ever done combat training, and that they've never even tried swinging a sword at a person before, only spiders. This interests Morris, who has the goblins recount their recent losses in the spider cave, remarking that it sounds like the goblins are just delivering their bodies as food for the spiders by going in like that. Morris thinks to himself that it seems they need both more basic training, but also more experience with handling a live enemy as well. The clear solution, he thinks, is that he should lead a party into the cave and capture some spiders. Morris heads to the call lobby, finding Sherlock there, and informing him that he has a brilliant idea. Sherlock asks him what it is. Morris explains that gladiators use living targets to increase their strength and experience, and so he would like permission to capture a spider to use in training. Sherlock permits this, warning him to take safety measures. Morris proudly states he will not allow Sherlock's servants to die carelessly, but Sherlock clarifies, saying that Morris should just protect himself and ignore the safety of the player goblins. Morris, not knowing that the player goblins can just make a new body when killed, takes this statement to mean that Sherlock must care about him, which pleases him greatly. Sherlock, on the other hand, wonders why Morris is looking at him with a weird expression. Declaring that he'll show his new lord his efficiency, Sherlock bids him good luck as he leaves. Back at the training grounds, Morris announces his plan to capture a spider to train with. He then asks if any brave goblins are willing to come with him, thinking to himself as he says it that goblins are cowards and that there's no way anyone will want to go. The thought isn't even finished in his mind before most of the goblins raise their hands, begging to be chosen. It sounds like a new, hidden quest to them. So why wouldn't they want to go? Morris is shocked to see that these goblins appear unafraid of the danger. He selects 10 of the goblins, telling the rest that they can come next time, which seems to leave the whole group pleased. Kuruko, who was chosen in the first group, approaches Morris and asks him to not die. If he's in danger, please just run away. We see why he said this, as the quest summary for this new event clearly warns the players that this quest can be repeated if failed, but only if Morris survives. The group sets off for the spider cave, with the goblins forming a tight formation around Morris. The players state that if they encounter danger, the plan is to run with the coach, since him not perishing is the top priority. Arthur is in the party and walks point, calling out that there's no spiders so far. Morris erupts in frustration, asking the goblins if they're just playing around. If they're not serious, they can just go home. He says that their scouts are exposing their position, and with everyone grouped around him, he has no room to fight. A goblin remarks that this NPC seems to have quite a personality, and that he's impressed it can interact with them in such a detailed way. Another goblin tells him to hush and not let Morris overhear this. The first goblin asks why. After all, it's not like he would cancel the quest just because he's talking about him right. The other goblin says it's hard to say. This game is so realistic. Who can know? Arthur tells the party to be quiet and that something is coming. The group prepares itself as 2 spiders skitter into view. Morris tells the group to kill one first and then distract the other. With a shout, he orders the goblins forward and they run towards their foes. That's the end of chapter 10. Seems like the dungeon is expanding. I hope you've enjoyed this recap presentation of Dungeon. Start by enslaving Blue Star players so far, and if you have, please like this video and please subscribe so you can catch the next installment. In addition, if you really liked this story, I'd ask you to look into who the original authors and illustrators of this work are and see if they have any current projects which you can support, or just send them a donation. I'm just starting this recap channel out, so I would love to hear your feedback and opinions, and I'd love to know about anything I could do to improve the quality of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.